I want to thank the good people of the Sunshine State for killing me in the most cold, calculated, clean, humane, and efficient manner possible. I have no complaints. These were not the words of a man begging for forgiveness, not a plea for redemption, nor a whisper of remorse. They were the final chilling statement of Edward Zakrzewski, moments before the state of Florida ended his life. His words were as sterile and methodical as the lethal injection flowing into his veins. A stark, shocking contrast to the chaotic, blood-soaked brutality that had put him on death row nearly 30 years prior. He was once a decorated technical sergeant in the United States Air Force, a husband, a father to 2 beautiful children. From the outside, he was a pillar of the community, a man living the American dream on the sunny coast of Mary Esther, Florida. But beneath that polished military facade, a darkness was festering, a darkness that would eventually consume not only his own life, but the lives of everyone he claimed to love. How does a man sworn to protect his country become the executioner of his own family? This is not just a story of a horrific crime. It is the story of a shattered family, a desperate escape, and a final statement so devoid of emotion it forces us to ask a terrifying question. Was there ever a human being inside the monster? Welcome to Unveiling the Crime. Today we unravel the tragic and disturbing case of Edward Zakrzewski. If you find value in stories that explore the deepest corners of the human psyche, please consider subscribing. To his neighbors in the quiet coastal town of Mary Esther, Florida, Technical Sergeant Edward Zakrzewski was the embodiment of military discipline and suburban stability. The United States Air Force doesn't just train soldiers. It forges individuals who value order, control, and precision. Zakrzewski's life seemed to be a portrait of that success, a respectable career, under the warm Florida sun, and a family to complete the picture. He was a man living a life that many would envy, seemingly grounded and purposeful. His wife Sylvia, and their 2 bright-eyed children, 7-year-old Edward III, whom they called Kim, and 5-year-old Anna, were the center of his world, or so it appeared. They were the human elements in his carefully structured life, the reason for the long hours and the military service. He was a father who played with his children in the yard, a husband who came home from the base every evening. From the outside looking in, the Zakrzewskis were just another family navigating the rhythms of daily life. They were, by all accounts, people building a future, not standing at the edge of an abyss. But behind the closed doors of their family home, a deep and irreparable fracture was forming. The foundation of Zakrzewski's world was beginning to crumble. Sylvia wanted a divorce. For many, this is a painful but navigable chapter of life. For Edward Zakrzewski, it was an interest threat. The divorce wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the loss of control, an assault on the very identity he had so meticulously built. The darkness brewing within him began to seep out, culminating in a chilling statement to a neighbor. It was a sentence that, in hindsight, was not a desperate remark, but a declaration of intent. He said he would rather kill his entire family than ever let them go through a divorce. The morning of June 9, 1994, began like any other, but a single phone call would ignite the fuse. At his post, Sergeant Zakrzewski picked up the line. On the other end was his 7-year-old son, Kim, his small voice delivering a message that would seal his family's fate. Mom wanted a divorce. For a man who had built his life on a foundation of absolute control, the prospect of its dissolution was not a tragedy to be endured, but an enemy to be annihilated. The soldier's mind began to plan a final, horrific campaign. During his lunch break, Zakrzewski did not go to the mess hall. He drove to a store and made a purchase. It wasn't groceries or a gift to win his wife back. It was a machete, a tool of raw agricultural utility, now repurposed as a weapon of pure carnage. He returned home from his shift before anyone else, a house steeped in a sterile quiet. He took the newly bought machete and hid it in the bathroom, a serpent waiting in the heart of the family sanctuary. Then he waited. When Sylvia, Kim, and Anna arrived home, the trap was set. The mask of the loving husband and father was still in place, but underneath, the executioner was ready. The argument he had been dreading with his wife began, and his calculated rage was unleashed. He grabbed a crowbar and attacked Sylvia with unspeakable violence. Blow after blow rained down. To ensure his monstrous task was complete, he wrapped a rope around her neck, strangling the last breath of life from her body. But even then, in his paranoid fury, he believed she might still be alive. He retrieved the machete and used it on the woman he had once promised to protect. The worst, however, was yet to come. With his wife's body lying still, he washed the blood from his hands and called for his son. He told 7-year-old Kim to come into the bathroom to brush his teeth, a routine fatherly command. As the boy stood at the sink, defenseless and trusting, Zakrzewski raised the machete. He then called for his 5-year-old daughter, Anna, and repeated the act of ultimate betrayal. The autopsy would later reveal a detail that elevates this tragedy into an almost unbearable realm of horror. Both children had defensive wounds. In their final moments, they had tried to fight back against their own father. They knew what was happening, and they tried to survive. Leaving his home a tomb, Zakrzewski fled. He drove north, eventually making his way across the Pacific to the tropical paradise of Hawaii, a grotesque juxtaposition to the hell he had created. For 4 months, he was a ghost, a fugitive hiding in plain sight. Back on the mainland, his case gained national attention when it was featured on the popular television program, Unsolved Mysteries. The broadcast showed his face to millions, stripping away the anonymity he desperately clung to. The net was closing. One day after the episode aired, on October 15, 1994, Edward Zakrzewski walked into a police station and surrendered. The manhunt was over. There would be no dramatic trial, no plea of insanity, no denial of the facts. Zakrzewski pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder. He stood before the court, not as a soldier, but as a confessed family annihilator. The legal battle was not about guilt, but about consequence. On April 19, 1996, Judge G. Robert Barron of the Okaloosa County Circuit Court delivered the only sentence he deemed appropriate for a crime of such calculated cruelty. For the murder of his wife, Sylvia, death. For the murder of his son, Kim, death. And for the murder of his daughter, Anna, death. The gavel fell, condemning Edward Zakrzewski to Florida's death row. For Edward Zakrzewski, the fall of the gavel was not an end, but the beginning of a different kind of existence. He was transferred to Florida State Prison, a world of concrete and steel, to live in the shadow of his own death. Time on death row moves differently. The days are monotonous, the years blur into one another, yet every moment is lived with the knowledge of how it will all end. For nearly 3 decades, this was Zakrzewski's reality. Season bled into season, and years stretched into a lifetime spent in a cage. He, like most on death row, pursued every legal avenue available. A litany of appeals were filed, arguing points of law and procedure, each one a desperate attempt to stave off the inevitable. His case moved slowly through the labyrinthine corridors of the justice system, from state courts to federal benches. But the facts of his crime were immutable, his confession undeniable. The brutality of his actions, particularly against his own children, who bore wounds from trying to defend themselves, left little room for judicial mercy. In the end, every appeal was met with denial. The final door closed on July 22, 2025, when the Florida Supreme Court rejected his last-ditch effort. The legal fight was over. The mechanism of the state, which had been dormant for so long, now whirred to life. On July 1, 2025, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis picked up a pen and signed the document that transformed Edward Zakrzewski from an inmate into a dead man walking, the death warrant. His execution date was set. The clock had officially started its final countdown. On July 31, 2025, the final ritualized choreography of state-sanctioned death began. Zakrzewski was granted a last meal. His request was a strange, almost suburban feast: fried pork chops, fried onions, potatoes, bacon, toast, root beer, ice cream, cake, and coffee. A meal that spoke of a life he had obliterated, a comfort he had denied his own family. As the designated hour approached, he was led into the execution chamber. He was 60 years old. Strapped to the gurney, he looked up at the witnesses behind the glass. There was no visible sign of fear, no tearful breakdown, no final plea for the souls of his victims. The man who had taken 3 lives in a storm of primitive rage would have his own life taken in a whisper of chemicals. At 6:12 p.m., the lethal injection began its silent work. A few moments later, a doctor entered the room, checked for vital signs, and pronounced Edward Zakrzewski II dead. He was the 9th inmate executed in Florida in 2025, a record-setting year for the state's death chamber. The physical story of Edward Zakrzewski had come to its clinical, inevitable end. But it was his final words, spoken in the face of oblivion, that would cement his legacy, leaving a chilling and perplexing question mark where a period should have been. What is the legacy of a man like Edward Zakrzewski? It is not found in buildings or achievements. It is a crater, an empty space where a family used to be. The legacy is the memory of 2 children, Kim and Anna, whose futures were stolen by the very hands that should have guided them. It's the ghost of a wife, Sylvia, who sought freedom and found only unimaginable violence. The impact of this crime isn't measured in headlines, but in the silence of a house that was once filled with laughter, and in the profound, unanswered question of why. Zakrzewski never offered a public explanation beyond the raw catalyst of his wife wanting a divorce. He never articulated a struggle with mental demons or expressed a moment of chaotic passion that he later regretted. His actions, from the purchase of the machete to the methodical slaughter of his family, were executed with the cold precision of a military operation. This lack of a narrative, this refusal to provide a reason for the unreasonable, is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of his case. It forces us to confront the terrifying possibility that sometimes there is no complex psychological puzzle to solve. Sometimes there is just a void, an absence of empathy so complete that a man can view his own children not as human beings to be nurtured, but as objects to be disposed of when his perfect world is threatened. And that brings us back to his final words. I want to thank the good people of the Sunshine State for killing me in the most cold, calculated, clean, humane, and efficient manner possible. I have no complaints. This was not a statement of peace. It was his final act of control. Stripped of all power, strapped to a gurney, he used his last breath to deliver a masterfully crafted piece of psychological warfare. The words are a mirror. He describes his own execution using the very adjectives that define his crime: cold, calculated, efficient. Was this a moment of dark, ironic self-awareness? A final cynical jab at a system he felt was no better than him? Or was it the ultimate expression of a sociopathic mind? A man so detached from human emotion that he could analyze his own death as if it were a technical procedure, devoid of any moral or spiritual weight. He offered no apology to Sylvia, Kim, or Anna. No acknowledgement. Their stoicism. In the end, Edward Zakrzewski's story is a chilling reminder that the most profound evil often wears a mask of normalcy. He wasn't a monster lurking in the shadows. He was a father, a husband, a soldier, a soldier. His case forces us to look at the people we think we know and wonder about the darkness that can lie dormant behind a disciplined facade, waiting for a single crack to appear before it consumes everything in its path. The case of Edward Zakrzewski is now closed. The legal system has rendered its final judgment. But the questions his life and death leave behind are far from settled. Is justice truly served when a man who committed such brutal acts is given a peaceful clinical death nearly 30 years later? Does the state, by adopting the calculated efficiency Zakrzewski himself praised, risk blurring the line between punishment and vengeance? And what do we do with a man who shows no remorse? We are conditioned to seek repentance in our villains. We want the confession, the tearful apology, a sign that the moral order has been restored. But Zakrzewski denied us that closure. His final words were not of regret, but of a cold, unsettling acceptance. Does a lack of remorse make a crime more evil? And can a person who feels nothing truly be held to the same standards of morality as the rest of us? This is not a story with an easy answer. It is a story that should make us uncomfortable. It challenges our definitions of justice, our understanding of human nature, and the terrifying fragility of the family unit. What are your thoughts on this? Was his final statement an act of cynical defiance, a sign of mental vacancy, or something else entirely? Share your perspectives in the comments below. Let's engage in a respectful and thoughtful discussion about the complex issues this case raises. If this story gave you pause and made you think, please consider sharing it. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of the darkest chapters of criminal history.